Good morning, everyone. My name is Robin DiPietro, and I am a program coordinator for OneOp. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session, How a Neurodiversity Mindset Helps Children Thrive. In case you're joining us for the first time, I'd like to give you a brief tour of our webinar platform so you can find your way around. Hopefully, you're currently able to view the slides that we're sharing. If you're unable to see them or you have any other difficulties, please email us at contact@oneop.org for tech support. And I just put that into the chat there. As some of you have already done, we look forward to having you join us in the chat pod for conversations and questions. To embed the chat pod so you don't miss any links or conversation, simply place your cursor over the shared slides. You'll then see a toolbar pop up across the bottom of your screen, and from there, just click on the chat bubble icon. When typing questions or comments, please be sure to select everyone from the response options drop-down menu so that everyone is able to view your comments or questions in the chat pod. Note that the slides and resources are available for download on the event page for today's session. We'll be covering continuing education information at the end of the webinar, so please stay tuned if you're interested in continuing education credits or a certificate of attendance. And you can access the slides and resources using that link that I just put in the chat. Thank you for joining us as we continue our partnership with the Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to expand the readiness, knowledge, and networks of the professionals supporting our military service members and their families. The views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the official policy of the Defense Department, U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. government, or OneOp. The mention of any entity or product is for informational purposes only. Before I introduce today's presenter, we want to oh, excuse me. At this point, I do want to introduce our presenter. Dr. Celeste Austin has dedicated her life to autism because of her autistic sister, Amanda. After earning an MD PhD from the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio, Dr. Austin knew she wanted to help more autistic children and founded GoManda, named after her sister, Amanda. Inspired by the unique learning style of Amanda and other autistic individuals, GoManda is dedicated to celebrating the unique mind of autism. GoManda has created a platform that teaches vocabulary using strength-based teaching, a teaching method that works with autism's unique learning style rather than against it. Dr. Austin is also a professor at the University of Texas in Austin. Before I turn things over to Dr. Austin, you may want to make sure you have a copy of those slides and pen or a pencil if you want to write anything down. And at this point, I will mute my microphone so that Dr. Austin can begin the presentation.
Thank you so much, Robin. I'm so honored to be here. I'm looking at the chat. I was looking at it prior to getting control of the slides and just seeing where everybody is from. I'm super honored to be able to share this information with everyone. As Robin mentioned, I'm super passionate about this information because of my own sister who's autistic, and I've named a company after her to help individuals like her by leveraging the science of learning for autism. So I've been very passionate about leveraging the amazing mind of autism, and also been fascinated with other neurodivergent conditions. So I can't wait to share this information with you. So today I really want to kind of help everyone identify the history of neurodiversity. I strongly believe that we need to know the history before we know where to go, recognize the neuroscience behind neurodiversity. How do we apply a neurodiversity mindset, and how do we integrate these neurodiversity affirming practices into everyday life? So I'm going to start by talking about what is neurodiversity, just in case no one, I know that's been a very hot topic, but just to get everyone on the same page, explore the history of neurodiversity, the myth of the normal brain, the psychological impact that we can have, and a neurodiversity mindset that can help children thrive. Excuse me. So I liked beginning this talk with one of my favorite quotes from the 90s, actually, which is from Harvey Bloom. Neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment? There is no normal flower or culture. Similarly, we ought to accept the fact that there is no normal brain or mind. And I absolutely love that this sets the tone of this particular talk as we kind of explore neurodiversity and the neuroscience and science that supports this idea. But let's kind of get to kind of some definitions. Um, so neurodiversity model is the idea that that different neurological wirings exist. This is for many people, this is an actual scientific fact. The neurodiversity paradigm, however, extends this idea. Not only is the idea that there's different neurological wirings that exist, but they are normal, natural variants in society. So disorders are actually just differences. And as you know, the individuals who are neurodivergent are growing, we've noticed that there's a movement now, a neurodiversity movement, a movement that seeks civil rights, equality, respect, and full societal inclusion for neurodivergent individuals. Now, who came up with this term? There's been a lot of talk now. It used to be associated with Judy Singer, who was the creator of neurodiversity. It was said to be created by her. But now we're seeing a lot of evidence that it was coined by autistic web forums in the 90s. So right now, a little bit controversial on who exactly came up with the term, but this is the current state of affairs, I guess. It's been strongly associated with the autism acceptance movement. So what you'll see during the talk is me focusing a lot on autism, but keep in mind that neurodiversity encompasses a lot of different conditions. And I've pointed out here kind of the seven most common neurodivergent conditions that are diagnosed during childhood. So keep in mind that it is a umbrella of conditions. We will be focusing on autism because that's where my expertise lies, and that's where the movement kind of started was with the autism acceptance movement. So at the heart of the neurodiversity movement, it's really about all people experience and interact with the world around them in many ways. And so there's no right way of thinking, no right way of learning or behaving, and these differences are not viewed as deficits. And it turns out that this concept is becoming more and more important as the population, about 15 to 20% of the population is neurodiverse. And as our diagnostic tools are becoming better, we're realizing that this number is growing. So this is becoming a very important issue. So let's talk about the history of neurodiversity. Again, I'm going to focus a lot on autism because this is the group that pretty much spearheaded neurodiversity. And of course, this is where my expertise is. However, keep in mind that you could probably build a timeline of any neurodivergent condition like this. But here you can see that autism, it has been a very evolving concept, not only in the scientific front, but also on the policy side. So in any disability movement, there's three waves. The first wave is typically the professionals, right? These are the individuals, scientists, researchers, medical professionals, whoever, who created the assessment, identified the condition, and might be having more of a deficit-based view because of that. As a response, as more and more, let's say, children are being diagnosed with this condition, what we're realizing is the second wave are usually parents and caregivers who are now saying, hey, I have this diagnosis, my child has this diagnosis, what do we do next? And so this wave is usually parents and caregivers advocating for maybe fixes or what they call cures, and maybe more funding and more resources and more policy to help their children. And then the third wave is the self, meaning as the growing population of those who received that diagnosis age into adulthood, they are now pushing for acceptance and inclusion. And so now the policies might shape into that particular wave. We can see that wave happening right now for autism. So during the early 1900s, stretching into the late 90s, we saw a lot of the professional wave happening. We saw the DSM, if you don't know what DSM is, basically the criteria manual for psychological and psychiatric conditions. We can see that it was an ever-changing definition that was happening about autism. And then perhaps starting a little bit early in the late 70s and stretching probably, you could argue now, is the parent or caregiver movement. But a lot of that, the peak of that was really in the 90s when a lot of the policies that we still use today, like the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is still being used, and the ADA were signed. And so a lot of that was pushed by caregivers and parents who were wanting something in schools, wanting something in the outside world to support the individuals with the diagnosis. And then what you notice, which is happening even today, is the self movement. And so it started about in the mid 90s and has been occurring and really gaining stride today thanks to social media. I did point out here, if you notice that I have the Wakefield vaccine controversy. I think a lot of us know about that time period when vaccines were said to be the cause of autism. I put that in there because I felt like that really disrupted the self movement of the disability movement for autism. It really took away the narrative that this was a condition that was, a neurological difference, but rather that it was caused by vaccines. And that really just shook things up, shook even the policies. If you notice in 2006, we even had a policy that was called Combating Autism Act. So this was very disruptive, but I think now that we understand more about what happened during that period, we can see that they are now gaining more stride in their movement. And we're seeing a lot of changes. You can see here in 2018, the global WHO ICD has actually, and that's their version of DSM in a way, in a very global sense, has actually added a lot more neurodiverse language. And they even mentioned masking, which is used a lot in the community. So keep in mind when I'm talking about neurodiversity, I just wanted to reiterate that even though I focused a lot just earlier about autism, that this really encompasses a large amount of conditions. These are just the 7 most common that are found in childhood in terms of diagnosis. But just keep in mind that we can apply these disability movements onto any of these conditions. So again, we're going to focus on a little bit on autism. As we look at the diagnostic criteria for autism, the current one in DSM-5, we can see that the two main players or two particular criteria is social communication interaction differences and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior. But this is an ever evolving diagnosis. You can see here, looking at DSM-1 all the way to DSM-5, we could see that it's been changing in terms of what we know about autism. As we learn more and more about autism, we are seeing it being shaped differently. So DSM-1, it was considered a part of schizophrenia, including DSM-2, part of the schizophrenia. And then as we moved to DSM-5, we can see it gets its own individual diagnostic criteria. And you can see that more, as we learn more, we can see that more traits or more cognitive abilities are being captured as we move towards DSM-5. I left these areas here. You see attentional differences, perceptual differences, sensory differences. I left those there, even though there's none of the DSM right now that captures that directly. I put that there because I think as we look at the growing research, those are areas that might be captured in the next DSM. Who knows? But these are things that we see in science that are particularly correlated with autism. So as we're moving through these disability waves that we just mentioned, we might see this definition, the criteria of autism change as more and more autistic scientists, clinicians enter the field. And as more autistic individuals and neurodivergent scientists are entering the field, we're noticing that we're seeing some evolution of how we're looking at neurodiversity and how we're looking even at autism. And so one way is by actually providing more robust definitions and robust understanding of neurodiversity. So one is if we could look at neurodiversity as just a difference in individuals' cognitive abilities. So if I took a neurotypical, or sorry, if I took a neurodivergent individual, and that's illustrated right here in this light gray, if you can appreciate that, and I just mapped up a bunch of different cognitive abilities. What we'll see in a neurodivergent individuals is that certain cognitive abilities they will be very exceptional on, and others they might need more support on, producing what's called a spiky profile. And so there'll be statistically significant differences between those peaks and those troughs. Whereas a neurotypical person so neurotypical meaning they are not neurodivergent, their profile might look a little bit more like a flat line, meaning that they are pretty average on every cognitive ability. We can see that that concept is becoming more and more evolved as we add more cognitive abilities. So some experts say that we can also call neurodivergent individuals as specialists because there are areas that they are exceptional at and areas that might need more support in. And so they are considered specialists, whereas neurotypical individuals might be considered more as generalists. And people have been taking this concept and creating more and more elaborate ways that we can understand a neurodivergent individual. So here is what I call a star chart, basically basically a map, taking what we just saw in the previous slide and building kind of a map that looks like this, where we can evaluate a student with their different cognitive abilities. And this helps us understand how we can support them and how we can leverage maybe some of their strengths to support them. And so there's different versions of these that are kind of floating around right now. And I have a prediction that this will be something that we will be more standardized, I hope, and that will be very, very helpful because these labels that we use may not actually give us a sense of how we can help and support these neurodivergent individuals. And this might be more helpful. So, as you can get a sense, this is there's been a lot of evolution in terms of how we view neurodiversity, how we view autism, and that's changing as we speak. And you might have been noticing that I've been using a lot of words like autistic person and not saying person with autism. And a lot of that was a choice because of the community communicating that they prefer autistic person rather person with autism. And that's called identity first language. Identity first language is autistic person, and person first language is person with autism. And I just kind of wanted to put this out here at this point of the talk, just to kind of make sure if you felt like I was using the wrong language, which has happened before, people have mentioned it, this is my opportunity to kind of defend, I guess, why I chose this language. So person first language emerged kind of in the 1970s. It was the idea that you put the person before the disability. It was widely used by professionals in medicine, academia, and education to this day. And it kind of is based on what's called the medical model of disability. Whereas identity first language, which emerged in the 1990s, the individuals who started this movement believe that disability is an integral part of their identity. It's widely used among self-advocates and neurodiversity experts. And it really is based on this social model of disability. So going over kind of some quotes that I've seen, um, person first language came from a very good place. For example, this quote eliminates generalizations, assumptions, stereotypes by focusing on the person rather than the disability. However, the advocates for identity first language, which is largely the community, the autistic community or the neurodivergent community, they're saying that people experience their world through their disability, making it a major contributor to who they are, and it shouldn't be separated from them as a person. And when I'm talking about this, I tell people that actually this movement for identity first language really started with the deaf and blind community in the early 90s when some of the policies started to come about. They noticed that the language used in those policies wasn't language that anyone had asked them if that was okay. And so they started to push a movement where they wanted to be identified as blind and deaf rather than whatever they were using in the past policies. And they won that. To this day, we say blind and deaf um, people. And so that is the same inspiration that autistic individuals want. They have pulled from that movement and have been trying to push for identity first language. And so 88% and more um, have autistic adults actually prefer being called autistic person rather than person with autism. Now, that does say that there are some about 10% who still like being person with like to be identified with person with autism. So my rule of thumb is when I'm talking about individuals as a whole, the group as a whole, I use identity first language. But then I always, if I'm talking with an individual, I ask them what they prefer. Now I mentioned medical model and social model. So what exactly are those? So the medical model defines, for example, autism as deficits that impair them from functioning normally. Whereas social model is it defines autism as a developmental disability with cognitive differences. And we've talked about those cognitive differences earlier. In the medical model, the person is defined by their deficits. Whereas in the social model, a person is actually considered disabled because of the attitudes, barriers, and lack of support from society. In the medical model, these deficits are abnormal and should be fixed, cured, or maybe even treated. In the social model, autism is just considered a natural variant of society. And in the medical model, once a person can rise above their autism, they can be normal and fit into society. Whereas in the social model, once the community can recognize these barriers to support autistic people, then these individuals can thrive. So the most simplistic way that I can illustrate medical model is that the problem is the individual, right? They need to rise above. They need to fix whatever's wrong inside of them. Where in the social model, we're looking more at the society, the barriers, the supports, the resources that are available to that person. And a large reason why there's such a gap between the medical model and the social model that we haven't totally adopted the social model is what's called the double empathy problem. And this is actually a problem that was created by an autistic researcher. This is a concept that he created. And it's basically saying that there's this gap of understanding between an autistic person and a non-autistic person. So both struggle to understand each other's differences, like their thoughts, maybe their behaviors and their feelings. However, the weight of understanding is usually on the autistic person's shoulders rather than the non-autistic person's shoulders, right? An autistic person is typically taught how to read the room, how to socialize, taught social skills, all to fit in with a non-autistic person's world. And I love this quote. This is a quote by Meg Proctor. She's an OT who's also neurodivergent, and she has this great quote to help us understand double empathy problem. We talk so much about how autistic kids struggle with perspective taking and social skills, but the truth is that non-autistic people have a really hard time taking the perspective of autistic people and using the social skills that help them feel at ease. And so it really flips the script, right? It really flips our perspective. We've been focusing so much and a lot on how autistic people need to adjust to the non-autistic world, but where is the reverse, right? And there's a great, this is also from her website, from Meg Proctor's website. She has a organization called Learn, Play, Thrive, which is a great site um, where we have these social stories if you're familiar with social stories, they're usually visual stories that autistic people use to understand the world around them. We have a bunch of social stories that help autistic individuals understand the non-autistic world. But where are the social stories to help non-autistic individuals understand the autistic world? So this really just flips that script and really opens your eyes on perspective, right, and mindset. how that plays a huge role in how we see things and how we can even help support neurodivergent individuals. And so I say to all of you that maybe you can help build this bridge, whether you're a clinician, whatever role that you play, you can be that person that helps create that bridge. Through a neurodiversity mindset and framework, we can more effectively address a wide range of learning needs. And now I open the floor up for any questions before we move on to the next section.
So there was one that came in into the chat, and it said, "Does this identity first also apply outside of neurodivergent community?" The individual said, "Perhaps I'm out of step. Something about hearing teachers or other kids talking about, quote, my special needs kids." That was one of the first questions.
Yes, and that's a great question. So they've done studies on language. For example, individuals with intellectual disabilities actually prefer person first. Um, and it just depends, really. I would say be curious and see what that community prefers. I will tell you, like I mentioned, the statistics for neurodivergent individuals is identity first. Special needs, going back on that, I know that that seems to be very controversial amongst the community. There's something about that that doesn't feel right for that community. So I always say get curious, ask around, maybe search on the internet. But I will say it's not a universal thing. So like I mentioned, person with intellectual disability, that group, they tend to prefer person first. So just be mindful that it's not universal. Just be curious.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good answer. There was another question. How would someone get an individualized map of their neuro differences?
Yes, great question. There's a great site called Exceptional Individuals. They have a great test that you can take to get your map. Um, I think there's a link if you go to the slides, there's a link there to kind of get you to that site. There's a lot of individuals working on the map to make it better. But I'll tell you that one is the one that is more accessible for the public.
Okay, good. And I will go double check the resources and then drop that link in the chat as soon
Oh,
as I
great.
get a chance to for folk. Another question says intervention work with disabled individuals seems to be getting a bad rap these days. How to address this conundrum when, as teachers, we might be working on skill acquisition with children with disabilities?
And say the first part of the question again.
Sure. Intervention work with disabled individuals seems to be getting a bad rap these days.
Hmm. So it depends on the intervention. I think that, this could be a whole talk. But I will say this. You need to think about what the intervention's intention is. Is the intervention truly about building skills um, for that individual to thrive as an adult? Or is it more for them to look normal? And I put that as in quotations. Um, we have to ask ourselves that question. The second half of this talk might plant that seed for you to start looking at the interventions from that lens. So those are where you have to be careful. Am I doing this so that they can look normal, or am I doing this because I truly care that they have the skills to thrive as an adult? There are a lot of roles, like social roles in our society, that might not necessarily apply to thriving as an adult. And actually, more and more tech companies are understanding that, for example, I know that there's a lot of stress on, direct eye contact during conversation. A lot of tech companies are going away with looking at that as a marker of a good interview because they understand that autistic individuals might find that painful. And so these social skills that we might be working on, right, during an intervention might not necessarily be helpful for skills as an adult. So we have to ask our question about why are we doing this intervention? And again, this could be a whole talk, and we can talk about this all day. And I actually really like talking about it. And there's very specific interventions that I think that are being asked about. So I think that's the main part. Are we addressing their needs, and are we giving them skills to thrive as an adult? Or are these particular interventions about having them appear normal or look normal? Are we destroying who they are, or are we helping them be who they are, their authentic self?
Great, thank you. Another one, can you talk about ABA? I'm concerned that its aim is to, quote, normalize the autistic person.
That's again, that's a perfect segue from the last
Yeah,
question. Um, yes, this could be an entire talk. So I will tell you the opinion of the autistic community and other neurodivergent communities is absolutely they do not agree with ABA. And a large reason is because they feel like it is the extinguishing of who they are. Like I said, trying to appear normal to society. It increases what's called masking. Masking is the act of kind of hiding who you are to people because of fear that you won't be accepted. Now, we all do some form of that, right? But imagine that this was something conditioned in you from a very, very young age. It manifests a little bit more in a toxic way, right? Um, the other thing about ABA that a lot of experts say is that it destroys what's called intrinsic motivation, meaning now most of my tasks are based on extrinsic motivation, meaning I get a star, I get a reward, and it kind of depletes the inside motivation of why we do things, right? So there's a lot of controversy about this. So that's my short, very, very short answer to what could be an entire talk.
yeah, yeah. And then the last one that I'm seeing there is this individual says, you may or may not get to this, or you may get to it later, but they're interested in any nuanced language approaches that help parents and caregivers get past the denial of a diagnosis and acceptance of the child.
That's a great
Yeah,
question. And yeah, we'll get a little bit into it, but that's a great question. I say to that, help a parent understand that I think there's this, I guess like a sadness sometimes that parents have because they have this idea of what their child would be and look like and all this. And to them, it's this idea that it's all gone. And I try to tell parents that no, actually, as long as we support this child and give them all the needs, have their needs met, they will thrive. It's just about getting the right resources. And in fact, something I always tell parents is actually, like I said, tech companies are now realizing the talent in neurodivergent individuals and other actually fields too. But I taste tech because of the autistic community. And so it's amazing that even these tech companies are realizing the talent. They've adapted their entire practice around helping support the needs of autistic individuals. The rooms are all designed in a way to be less sensory heavy, things like that. So as long as we can support neurodivergent individuals, they can thrive. And we can use language like strength-based. We can say leveraging their strengths because as we talked about the spiky profile, we can leverage those exceptional cognitive abilities to help support them. Um, and so looking at it from that perspective, even introducing the idea of spiky profile might give a little bit more reassuring, it might be a more reassuring concept.
great. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's it. I think we're good to move
Awesome.
ahead.
I love
Others, if
these
there,
questions.
yeah, yeah, if there are additional questions, please drop them in the chat and I will keep track of them. And then when we have our next question time, I'll have a hold of them.
Awesome. All right. So I love the questions. Let's move forward. So now let's talk about the myth of the normal brain. And what I like to talk about is kind of how did we get here? So as a reminder, the neurodiversity movement is all about celebrating, right, the diversity and empowering people whose brains work differently. It turns out there's a lot in biology, there's a lot in neuroscience that shows that differences are favored. Throughout the entire history of our planet, it turns out differences are favored. So, the most simplistic example I can give you is this. Imagine I had what's called a monoclonal species, meaning they're all clones of each other. What that means is they have the same strengths and the same weaknesses, right? AKA same vulnerabilities to the environment. And so let's say the environment um, leverages that vulnerability, well, they would all die, right? Because they all have the same vulnerability. However, if the society or this species was diverse, genetically, right? What we'll see is that they have different strengths and different weaknesses. And so when that same environmental insult comes about, yeah, we might lose the pink guy, but the species persist, right? And so this is the most simplest way that we can explain how differences are favored in biology. We can take that idea that differences are needed for survival in human progress. So it turns out a lot of experts believe that we needed neurodiversity to survive as a human species or race, I guess. Um, and so, for example, autistic individuals were probably those that were excellent at detecting different poisonous plants and mushrooms and things like that. ADHD was probably perfect for hunting, and dyslexic individuals were probably perfect for navigating complex terrain and being the leaders of helping us go in through complex terrain like forests and mountains and so forth because of their 3D spatial capabilities. So if neurodivergent individuals are crucial to our survival, why does medicine and neuroscience research, at least in the past decade, adopt a deficit-based approach? And it all really starts with this idea that, and this is, I said the US history of standards, but really it was a global history as well. Around the 1840s, when the Industrial Revolution was happening, we realized some key concepts that helped the Industrial Revolution take off, and that was standardizing the screw. If you can imagine a world before that, where every machine had, and not even just one machine, different parts of the machine all had different types of screws. What a nightmare that was, right? Every year we have to make new screws. If we need to repair it, we have to find that screw, then that one part of the machine. It's a nightmare. And so the standardization of the screw really took off and created more standardized machines with standardized screws, and that really helped our Industrial Revolution. We took that concept and we took it on everything else, right? We started to standardize dogs, right? We, of course, standardized medicine, which was, of course, the right move, right? We wanted to make sure every medicine had the same formula. But then we did something else. We started to standardize education in the 1980s in response to the Cold War. And then we started to standardize when the genomic project came about and neuroimaging came about. We kind of started to use that concept on genes and brains. And so there's something dangerous about that because we are using our own assumptions to interpret human-centered sciences. And that becomes a dangerous place. So, like neuroscience and behavioral science, when we have us as humans looking at human-centered sciences, something ends up happening. So, one of my favorite stories about this is early neuroscientists, before there was even neuroimaging, they were so obsessed with finding the neurological evidence of natural inferiorities. And so they had this belief that there was a particular group of people that had higher intelligence. We're going to call them Group A. And so they believed the Group A folks, they are smarter and they must be smarter because they use more of their brain. And this was prior to any neuroimaging that occurred. Well, when the first initial neuroimagings came out, they of course ran at the chance of comparing Group A to everyone else, Group B. And what they noticed was something interesting. Group A actually used less of their brain than Group B. Now you would have thought, man, they must have, flipped the script and said, oh, right, we were wrong. Nope, they didn't. They just basically interpreted that Group A was still superior and more intelligent only because they efficiently used one part of their brain. They even termed it something. They said it was called intrahemispheric specialization. So you can see how problematic it is when we use our assumptions to interpret data in human-centered sciences, how we can place and push our agenda and our assumptions onto the interpretation of data. This can be found in neuroscience with neurodivergent conditions like autism. For example, if you look at some of the scientific papers, areas of the brain that had more volume So usually in neuroanatomy, more volume equates to exceptional. Um, those are largely ignored in uh, autistic individuals. And so they are actually searching for less volume to explain the deficits, but ignoring the high volume areas. One of the most interesting things is when we looked at Einstein's brain after he passed away, um, there was some unusual folding seen in his temporal lobe. It turns out you can find those same unusual foldings in autistic brains, but those are actually interpreted as part of why they have quote unquote deficits. So because we knew that Einstein was a genius, we looked at those unusual foldings and interpreted it as part of his genius. But when it came to autistic individuals, that same folding, that's just part of why they have quote unquote deficits. So you can see how we can use our assumptions to shape how we interpret data in human-centered sciences. And so there's a lot of science out there, a lot of papers out there trying to search out the parts of the brain that are deficit. I still put that in quotes if you can't, I know you can't see that, for autism. And we haven't really landed on a reproducible theory. We haven't really came up with anything. And so it makes us think in the last 15 years, we really haven't found that answer. And we also have noticed in the last 15 years that the influence of neuroscience has been a hot topic as the weight of these types of research can have a huge societal impact, right? The way that we interpret this data can really have an impact on how we help neurodivergent individuals. And so, with no really definitive biological findings, it really brings into question the pursuit in itself. And so, the best that we can do right now is really taking that neurodiversity-based framework, listen to the growing autistic individuals who, who are becoming professionals, and seeing what they say, what is important, especially when it comes to learning. And, we can adapt. We can value human differences that have often been pathologized and underscore the strengths associated with each unique neurological design. And we can form these partnerships that include neurodiverse individuals in order to enhance problem solving in this complex world. And I really believe one of us, have a really important role to play in making sure that the benefits of neurodiversity is more widely appreciated and making sure we empower those different thinkers in mainstream life, thought, and culture. And as I talk about all of this, these assumptions that we kind of we may have about different people, especially about human-centered science, I want to introduce this amazing study that came out in the last 5 years. And it's really challenges the idea of what is deficits. So this particular research study kind of organized people into three groups. The first group was all autistic individuals. The second group had only non-autistic individuals. And then the third was a mixed half autistic, half non-autistic, a mixed neurotypes. The point of the research was, or I guess part of the research was to start what's called a diffusion chain. So, layman term, telephone game. Basically, telling a story to the first person in each group and seeing if that story is preserved. So, for example, the researcher will tell the original story, and of course, telephone game or diffusion chain, that story will be told to each individuals down the chain. And so if you won the telephone game, it would mean that the original story would equal story number 8, right? The last person on that chain. And so because autism is defined clinically by deficits of social communication, it may be expected that autistic people might find it difficult to share information with other people. Therefore, it would be expected that the autistic group and maybe even the mixed group would have decreased recall of story details. But something interesting happened. When they looked at the autistic to autistic social interaction, they took a survey after the story. First of all, they looked at the preservation of the story, and then they took a survey. The preservation of the story was excellent between autistic to autistic social interaction. Not only that, when they took a survey, those individuals said reported no social deficits amongst the individuals that they interacted with. With the non-autistic to non-autistic social interaction, again, the story was preserved, and when they took a survey afterwards, they reported no social deficits amongst the people that they interacted with. But when we mix the neurotypes, autistic to non-autistic social interaction, we noticed something interesting. The story was not preserved. Not only that, that when we did the survey, we found that both parties actually reported social deficits on the people that they reported they interacted with. What does this all mean? If autism is defined clinically by social and communication deficits, why do these deficits disappear during autistic to autistic interactions? The deficits that are used for diagnostic criteria are actually in this study dependent on the environment and the type of neurotype who is performing the evaluation. It's neurotype dependent. And what we've know also is that they can also vary by culture, right? For example, eye contact in Asian countries may not, lack of eye contact in Asian countries might not be seen as a deficit. So deficit labels are not this fixed idea, but they're changed based on context and even culture. And so it really challenges our idea, what is deficit? What am I calling, if I'm telling a child that they, or if I see a child and I perceive something as a deficit, is it truly a deficit? So there's no lab or imaging test that we can reliably use to diagnose most neurodivergent conditions. So this means that when we are performing a diagnosis, we're using self-reported or caregiver-reported information and practitioner observation. So this is a way to, in this, the point of this is saying, what are we saying? What are deficits? When I report that there is a deficit, is it because I have a different neurotype? So I'm hoping that we've started to challenge the idea of deficits, challenge the idea of the lens that we can wear when we're helping neurodivergent individuals. What is the psychological impact when we don't do that? When we let the idea that these individuals might be broken or need to be fixed and cured, what happens when we do that? Well, here are some kind of ads that, these are older ads. This happened in 2007, but these are ads that, as you can see, are based on this idea that there's something wrong with this person. So these are these ransom notes that this hospital kind of came up with as ads. And I'm hoping at this point of the talk, you find this highly inappropriate. So the ransom note reads, "We have your son. We will make sure he will not be able to care for himself or interact socially as long as he lives. This is only the beginning. Signed, autism." So you can see how the attitudes, the way that we look at autism, we look at other neurodivergent conditions can shape this narrative, right? This is another ad that came out in 2013 in Seattle. "Let's wipe out cancer, diabetes, and autism in his lifetime." Right? And I'm hoping at this point in the talk you find that inappropriate. Most filicide suicide victims are autistic, meaning a mother, um, infant suicide. And the last words, they usually fall back on this linguistic separation, meaning I love my child very much and I hated autism and wanted autism out of my life. You can see how this can shape the attitudes of the people that we work with when we use very deficit-based language, um, and the way that we perceive, right? What we need to learn is that autism is part of this person and this is who they are. And if we keep working on separating that from the person, we formulate an existence or possibility of that life without autism. Yet autism cannot ever be separate from the person. To combat autism is to combat autistic people. The effect of these societal expectations on autistic individuals is alarming. This weight is a reason why actually autistic individuals are 3 times more likely to commit suicide. 70% of autistic youth have a mental health condition, like including depression, anxiety, and autistic individuals are 4 times more likely than neurotypical individuals to experience depression over the course of their lives. So these attitudes and the effect of these societal expectations is not to be ignored, right? We're seeing that this has an impact. It does have an impact on autistic individuals and neurodivergent individuals as well. So how can we help children thrive by using a neurodiversity mindset? This is a great drawing from a neurodivergent individual, and it's a great Instagram. It's called Neuro Wild. Great graphics to kind of explain the lived experience of being neurodivergent. And one thing that this person challenges is what is perceived on the outside and what's really going on in the inside. So, for example, here on the left, this is what people see, a child that has these behaviors. But what is really going on inside is maybe sensory dysregulation, maybe all these expectations by everyone around them, emotional dysregulation, maybe their skills are not yet formulated. And so they're kind of struggling, right, to balance all of these different needs. So what is our role? Our role, our best way to support neurodivergent kids is to lighten that load. Let's help give them a sensory environment that is more favorable. Let's get rid of those expectations, right? Let's put our neurotypical expectations, I should say. Let's help them with their emotional dysregulation. Let's help them in all of these so that their load is lightened and then therefore they can thrive. So one of the most important things that I say is a large percentage for autistic individuals, up to 95% of autistic children have some sort of sensory difference. And it's one of the most first things that I say, if you want that child to thrive, address those sensory differences. We live in a world where there is so much sensory input. And there are some experts that theorize that part of why autistic individuals are struggling in this modern world is because of all the sensory inputs that there are in this modern world. And so, what we can do is help with that, provide a more sensory, based on their differences, right? Accommodate for their sensory difference and help your child regulate when they're experiencing big emotions. When you have sensory differences, this is kind of correlates with experiencing big emotions, right? Emotions can be a sensory experience. And so those big emotions are going to feel very different for a neurodivergent individuals. And of course, going back to some of those questions that we had, don't let people hold your child to neurotypical expectations. Looking what's quote unquote normal or looking neurotypical. That narrative can be very harmful to their very self-esteem, self-worth. So make sure that you are embracing the differences of your child. So I took this and I created this great map. Of course, each of these topics can be a talk in itself. So I guess in some ways, this is the talk for this particular talk is about the mindset. And so it really all starts with the mindset. And so I hope by the end of this talk, there's been a shift or maybe a reaffirming of your mindset. But one of the greatest way that we can be an ally is to have that wear that neurodiversity lens. Understand that there's this double empathy problem. Use the correct language that's supported by the community. And I always say, stay curious. The more we are curious, the more we learn, and the more that we get rid of our assumptions, right? If we're curious, we're not living in our assumptions, our assumption cage is like what I call it. And these are the mindset of everyone in that child's ecosystem, right? Their family, their care team, and so forth. Once we have that mindset, we are more able to understand the child's needs and how we can support them, especially in their environment. So, of course, first, their physical environment. addressing those sensory needs. As I mentioned, up to 95% of autistic individuals have some sort of sensory difference. And of course, then embracing their learning style. These sensory differences can lead to learning differences. So understand that there's a science of learning for neurodiversity. Um, Interest-led programs, meaning preserving their intrinsic motivation, not giving into programs that get rid of that and enhance extrinsic motivation. And then using a strength-based approach, as we talked about in a spiky profile, we can leverage the exceptional cognitive abilities and use those to help support the child. Once these two aspects come together, we consider that as a child's needs are finally met. And that means that we give them a safe environment to thrive. And of course, that safe environment is not just physical environment and providing all the resources, but it's an overall feeling, right? It's a feeling that everyone around is supporting them and does not see them as broken. Um, and there's tons of studies that show that autistic kids, neurodivergent kids who grow into adulthood report that they could feel maybe their teacher not really thinking that their expectations were low of that child. We're not talking about neurotypical expectations, just academic expectations. They could feel that. They could feel that that they were deemed less than. So as much as if we're trying to pretend, it doesn't come across as pretend. Kids are pretty perceptive. And so that's why mindset is so important, really believing about neurodiversity. Once a child's needs are met, they can thrive. And then we can start teaching them about self-advocacy. How can they support themselves in the adult world? How can we build those skills to help them become independent adults or just be thriving adults? And I take a quote from a paper that was written a few years ago that actually partnered with neurodivergent individuals. And they kind of worked together to come up with this quote, which I absolutely love. And I love closing the talk with this. And it says, small moments within everyday interactions shape children's understandings of the world, of themselves, and of others. A community is a sum of its parts. Be your part. The world needs exactly you. And I love that. This is a great message. And I hope, based on everything we talked about, this has helped shape how you can help support neurodivergent individuals. And now I open the floor for some more questions.
Great, thank you. So, if you have put your questions in the chat so far, I've got them all kind of queued up here. If you haven't, feel free to drop them in there. We've got some time for your questions for sure. But let's start with one that was regarding the Crompton study, that communication chain study.
Oh,
So
yes.
the the deficits, are they also dependent on the type of task? Such as, in
Oh,
that story, it was retelling a story, but in other studies, maybe it's some other. Do they see different things when it's a different shared task or shared or team task, not just a social communication task?
right. And so keep in mind deficits, the way that this study is shaping the word deficit also is reported, right? Reported by perhaps the observer, reported by maybe the person who's interacting with others. So keep in mind that that's kind of the heart of these research studies is if somebody's reporting something, do they see something that's a deficit versus someone else? And we do see that in other studies that happens, not just in this diffusion chain, but a perception of someone watching, like two different people watching the same task done by a neurodivergent individuals can be interpreted differently. Um, and there's also, they've done studies with the cultural differences, right? Taking somebody from different cultures and seeing how they interpret the same data. Um, so I don't know if that answers your question. Of course, there needs to be more studies. I would love to see more studies exploring this concept. I think it's really interesting. Um, but I hope that answered. I'm not sure that answered the question.
No, I think that was helpful. If that didn't answer the question, feel free to pop a follow-up in the chat. Um, another question that came in is, what is your advice about our use of language for autistic individuals? Should we start saying neurodivergent? Or, if we don't, if we're not sure, like if someone maybe has an ADHD condition or maybe diagnosed with ADHD, should we just say neurodivergent instead of ADHD? And I think that's what the question's getting at.
Okay, yeah, I like that. My rule of thumb is so if they are at the age where they can advocate for themselves, always ask them first. If they're not at that age, they're still kind of at that age where maybe it's more the parents speaking for them, because that's usually what happens when they're in pre-K and so forth. I weigh on what the community says. So for if they are autistic, I say autistic person. If I'm talking about a group, including ADH, autistic, and so forth, I say neurodivergent. You can stick with neurodivergent if you want to, that's okay. I would say using a more specific label is important when you're talking to professionals because it helps with supports, right? If I say someone's autistic, there might be a list of supports that come to someone's head versus saying neurodivergent. Um, I usually say neurodivergent for my own personal. If I'm just talking in general, whether it's autistic or ADHD or anything, I'll just say neurodivergent. I'll even say it if I don't want to disclose someone. I don't know if they want people to know, but I know that they're okay and comfortable with neurodivergent. I might do that. It just really, you can't really speak to someone's individual's choice. So I always weigh on that if they are at that age where they can advocate for themselves. I do like the word neurodivergent because it helps introduce conversation too. Some people might not have heard of neurodivergent before, so I like that too. So it's a good umbrella term. Um, but when I'm talking with professionals, I feel like being more specific is helpful.
Okay, thank you. As an MD PhD, how do you address other professionals in your field who continue to have a medical model perspective? And what might we do or say to our colleagues who tend to be more deficit focused?
That's a great question. And that is one of the challenges of being in this field is, you do see that kind of lens. However, I have found that there is a spectrum within the professional world of people who are very receptive to this. I actually give talks to psychiatrists, fellows actually, who are just about to go into their practice. And I found that they're extremely receptive. In fact, all of them know that what we're using right now is not entirely helpful. They recognize that deficit-based lens is not 100% helpful. And so they're very receptive to this idea. So I have a lot of faith in the growing newcomers coming into different professions based on, my own experience. And so I found out that they're very, very receptive. I will say that when I'm talking to professionals, I stick to the data that I know. For example, one of the studies that we've talked about in this talk. And sometimes that does introduce a little question mark in their head. It's really tough when there's people with, like I said, rigid assumptions who may not necessarily have been keeping up with the recent research. And I do find that personally challenging. Um, and all I can do is say, I'm not coming up with this out of nowhere. This is all based on science. There's research papers to support what I'm saying. And, you know, that's all I can do, right? And, it's your responsibility, as a professional to do what you think is right too. But I will say, if you're, I do have a lot of optimism for the new coming professionals coming in. I feel like they are extremely receptive. And I really think that when I do these talks to these fellows, their jaw is on the floor. They didn't know any of this. And I find that so fascinating. And it's so interesting to see that seed planted in their head about changing their perception. And so I don't know if I particularly answered the question, but that's my take of that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's helpful. Can you address the difference in numbers of diagnosis over the years? We've seen over the last, I guess, couple of decades that one in every so many children are diagnosed with autism, and now it's one in every so other many. And can you
Right.
address what the difference in numbers might be over the years?
So they've done some studies about this. Obviously, one explanation is that we're better at diagnosing, right? We've become more clear on the diagnostic criteria. The other is that they've shown that actually the majority of the increase in the diagnosis um, is due to increase of diagnosis of mid-level support, for example, for autism, mid-level support autistic individuals. So for some reason, when we kind of crystallize the diagnostic criteria, we were able to identify those who had mid-level amount of supports needed. So that created a robust increase in diagnosis. And I know that there's a small percentage, as perhaps for any diagnostic criteria in the mental health or neurological space, um, that some of it can be, due to what I've heard is just giving services to the parents, right? Giving them a diagnosis so they can get services. And that muddies, right, everything. That creates a little bit of an issue. But they've done studies and they've shown that that's only a small percentage of the increase. More of it is because of like I said, the mid-level support. And autistic individuals who need just mid-level supports, they tend to be the reason why there's an increase in the diagnosis. Um, and I think, historically, those who were actually autistic were kind of seen as perhaps intellectually disabled. Maybe the tools used to evaluate their aptitude were not favored for their perhaps the way that they perceive and can see questions, right? If we ask questions auditory and they are very visual, how is that a good assessment of their aptitude? So there's a lot of like other variables to consider as to the diagnostic pool was so small in the past. And keep in mind, autism was introduced in 1911. So really it's a fairly, if you want to call it new, I mean it's been evolving since then. And so we've been more and more refined. And I think that's part of the reason too.
Great, thank you. Is there a resource that you recommend to help assess what someone's sensory preferences might be?
Oh, that's a great question. So, there's a few great resources now. A lot of times it's better to weigh in with a expert who can help deliver that assessment. I believe the Meg Proctor has a great place to assess that. If you look at her site, I don't want to say with complete confidence, but I believe I saw it on her website. Um, and there's another website called Bridges Learning. They also have a sensory assessment on their site. Um, there's a variety of, if you just do a simple search, you might find some really great resources. Um, and maybe somebody here who's a OT or PT might have a better suggestion. But I know that those two places I know have some sort of sensory assessment. But that's a great question. If somebody in
Great.
the community knows, I would love to see what they use.
Yeah, if those of you in the participants, if you have feedback or ideas to some of these questions and know of resources like Dr. Austin said, please do drop them in the chat so that we can all learn from one another. Um, I will get the Bridges link to the additional resources and then also put it in the chat in just a moment. Um, so, as we become more accepting of all differences, how do you see the field of special education changing? Um, and then there's a somewhat related question that maybe you can answer kind of together, but regarding ABA, is there a fine line between socialization and altering deficits?
Mm. So special education, and yeah, there's a good segue there. Um, you know, obviously, like what we were just talking about, moving away from a deficit base and more from to a strength-based approach. Meaning that I feel like changing the way we assess a student, maybe looking more at their strengths, like their spiky profile, and looking at where they need support and seeing how we can use both to help support the student. That's what I'm excited to see in special education. Individualized, which is special education, more individualized approach. When we're talking about ABA, yeah, so like I said, we have to be careful with approaches that are about changing the way the student or child looks to the outside world, meaning their behaviors. Like, are we stressing eye contact because I need a way to know that they're listening? Um, or so we have to ask those questions. Or is there other ways I know that the child's listening without eye contact? Um, the problem with ABA, like I mentioned before in a previous question, for many people who are against it, is the lack of intrinsic motivation. Meaning, a lot of ABA is based on extrinsic motivation. Meaning, I'm doing this for a star. I'm doing this for a reward. And so we have to ask ourselves: are we doing that? Are we trying to kind of destroy, in a way, a child's own, listening to their own body, listening to their own desires and interests? So there's this other approach called interest-led, right? So kind of being curious about the child's interest. For example, if they like birds, for example, well, let's make sure that our lessons are bird related, right? Interest led. So that way it doesn't feel like we are trying to brainwash, or trying to reinvent what they already like. So it's important to kind of find this balance between giving them skills that are actually helpful for them as adults and not destroying who they are. Um, and it's a really hard balance to find for many professionals, because sometimes certain social skills might be viewed as skills they need as an adult. Um, so I do say, one of the things I say is be curious and go on into just Google and look up masking, look up ABA, autistic, you know, see what the autistic community says. What those who had gone through the experience, that approach, what are they saying? And there's a lot of professionals now who are autistic and who had gone through ABA who have their own opinion about what happened and how they felt. One of the themes is when you're conditioned to think that there is something intrinsically wrong with you, um, then there's this incredible um, idea, this incredible, like, I guess, idea that you're not worthy, right? Your self-worth is incredibly low if you've been taught that all of your life. There's a systemic idea that, hey, you are broken. There's something wrong with your inclinations, right? If you want to STEM, for example, those are all wrong. You're wrong. That manifests in such a toxic way. It creates masking. I mean, it happened with my sister too. I can't get for many years, it was hard to get a true answer from her because she was trained to have these very canned responses to me. And I really found that frustrating because I just wanted to know what was going on inside. But she had been trained over the years that I have to say these very canned responses. So that's an example, right? Um, so it's about that balance, making sure that you're not destroying the authentic self of the person. I'm not sure if I answered the question. If there's anything I missed, please let me know.
No, I mean, I think that that kind of tracks for a lot of these things, right? It's about making sure that we're not trying to change who they are, right? And accepting them for who they are. And some of it also is landing on um, those of us, folk who are neurotypical to also, I go back to that Crompton study, which was just mind blowing for me because it reminded me that I need to also kind of reframe the way I think about communicating with people in general, because I don't know who is or isn't, right? And that perhaps it's just because it's different from me or the way I would handle it or say it doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with anyone. It's just different. Uh,
Right.
yeah.
Yes.
So,
And
oh, go ahead.
go ahead. Go, no, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say another question that I found that came in the chat that was unique was someone was wondering if you could address the benefits of the arts for neurodivergent
Oh,
individuals.
absolutely. Actually, there's so much, there's art therapy, there's even music therapy. It turns out for music therapy, for example, some autistic individuals, for example, have what's called gestalt language processing, and they actually benefit from music. So hearing words, hearing sentences with music. And for whatever reason, like the neuroscience behind that is there's just some certain pathway that gets activated when you sing or when you hear things in music that just resonates with the autistic brain. So I find that really, really interesting. So that's something to explore. Arts, absolutely. I think it's a great way, especially for an autistic individual who may be still working on communicating, um, in terms of maybe they're not speaking, they're non-speaking. Maybe arts is a great way for them to communicate, and express themselves. So, as you know, that there's different communication differences in the autistic community, and so different forms of communication, especially since their brains are more visual, those are excellent places for autistic people to thrive.
Great. So, another question was, do you ever refer to people being on the autism spectrum disorder versus being diverse? Because I know the language has changed a lot over time. And so I think there's
Yes.
a question around that.
So there was a whole study done with over I can't remember the exact number, but over 1,000 autistic individuals, and they asked them what languages are acceptable and not. Obviously, autistic person out of the spectrum of selections, there were all kinds of variations, was the most popular. Then they said the second one is person on the autism spectrum. So getting rid of the disorder, person on the autism spectrum, or and so not on the spectrum, but on the autism spectrum. And then I think lower is, like I said, person on the spectrum. And a neurodivergent person or individual is also up there as well. That's acceptable. Um, and so when you're talking about a person, you say neurodivergent person. When you're talking about population, you say neurodiverse. So there's very like some nuance to how you accurately talk about neurodivergent versus neurodiverse communities. Um, and of course, you can say autistic community. That's okay. That's acceptable. So that study was really interesting because we got really a sense of what was acceptable language.
Yeah, thank you. It sounds like, it sounds like a lot of things where we are kind of caught between, making sure we're using appropriate language in all manner of ways, right? And so just remembering to be curious, but also to be humble, right? And so if we get it wrong, just
Absolutely.
apologize and say, "Oh, please tell me what do you prefer?" Right? I think there's some that curious and humility kind of go together.
Absolutely. And it's all about intent.
Right.
You are there to, honor that person, with their preferences. That goes a long way, even if you
Yeah.
make a mistake, as long as you have good intentions and you honor their preference.
Yeah, for sure. One individual mentioned they have a 22-year-old son with high functioning autism and that he was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder last year. And they're curious if you see any connections between children with autism developing schizophrenia later in life.
That's a great question. And that is something I've actually looked into recently. It turns out for many years, there was this taboo about coexisting diagnosis of autism and anything in the schizophrenia or schizoaffective realm. And I think that was a vestigial habit from the fact that autism at some point was part of the schizophrenia diagnostic criteria. Um, but recently, I've seen more and more kind of papers talking about perhaps there is some coexisting. I don't know if there's a really strong correlation just yet that we're seeing. As I said, for a long time, there was a little fear of putting those two diagnoses together, but I'm seeing again like that's changing. So we don't have a good database to know really that correlation. We're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, but so I'm not sure yet because there was, like I said, there was a bit of a habit of not putting those together. So that's a good question, though.
Great, thank you. Um, can you recommend any activities or specific resources that can help people improve the double empathy problem?
Yes. Okay. So obviously, it starts with being curious, and I know I keep saying that. Um, But if you have individuals who are autistic and non-autistic, what I recommend is making sure we are addressing all the communication styles. So if we are trying to understand each other, make sure that if you are doing any kind of like team assignment or team bonding assignment, make sure that um, there's visuals, the sensory aspects are addressed, and being kind of transparent that that's what you're doing. You're providing, you're addressing the sensory environment for any, you don't have to pinpoint anybody. You can just say we're just addressing all the sensory environments. Um, and I also would encourage dialogue. If they're at that age, and I'm assuming we're talking about, I'm not sure we're talking about students, but if they're at that age where they can be, if they're willing, you can pair them off into groups and have them kind of understand each other from, having questions and prompts, um, asking having the standard question for each person. What are your sensory preferences? What are your sensory preferences, whether they're neurotypical or autistic? Um, those are great ways of opening dialogue and opening curiosity. Really, ultimately, I keep saying this, and I know it's kind of super cliche, but really you're trying to plant that seed of curiosity, having this idea that not everybody's the same. And I
Yeah.
think, yeah. And so even doing an exercise like the star chart, where we talk about different cognitive abilities, doing that as an exercise for everybody and seeing where everybody is and comparing their star chart is a great way of also noticing that everyone has very different cognitive abilities and we're all different. And in order for us to thrive as a team, for example, you don't want everybody to be the same. You want everybody to have different skill sets that they bring to the table
Yeah,
and abilities.
great, thank you. As we wrap up, I just wanted to thank everyone for their engagement in the chat. One of the things that I will also say is that I have 4 children, and 3 of them would kind of fall in this umbrella of neurodivergent. And in doing research leading up to this series, reading a few books and things like that last summer, as a mom, my mind was completely blown. Now my oldest is almost 20, and she is neurodiverse. So you can think back the timeline and what you showed earlier in the waves that it made me really kind of wish I had known what I know now then, right? Of course. But this idea that there's nothing wrong with someone who thinks different or who is different in their, who has a different brain than mine or than yours or whatever, and that, really embracing the need for both people to work together to understand one another was just mind blowing for me and really changed the way that I interact with my kids and the way I view this entire topic. So I'm really, really grateful that you were here today to share with us. And we had a question come in from someone asking if there was a way to follow you for further trainings or talks. And I know we're going to share your email and your website here in just a minute, but I didn't know if there were any socials or things like that that you had that you wanted to recommend or mention.
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, I actually have an Instagram handle. You can just find me with Celeste Austin, MD, PhD. I'm actually doing a whole rehaul of that social media. I'm going to, in these challenging times, I want to post a bunch of things, information for parents, information for professionals, um, to provide them a little bit more understanding of neurodiversity, and things like that. So, yes, excellent.
Okay, great. And there's a question in the chat about what books that I read. And what you all don't see on the backside of this is that I'm handling about 16 different windows. So I can't answer that right this very second. But if you'd like to send me an email, which will give you that email address in a second, but then I can definitely answer it when I don't have my brain running in 60 directions at this point. But okay, so thank you all so much for being here and for taking the time, and thank you, Dr. Austin, for this incredibly great foundational talk. As many of you may know, this is a series of webinars we're doing this year, and so you can find more about the series and what we're doing all year long if you go to our website. And the whole series is at OneOp website. Put it right there for you. There it is. That's our whole series for the year. The next one, however, on April 10th is going to be called Decoding Challenges, Understanding Adversity, Trauma, and Developmental Delay. This webinar is going to address how to distinguish between neurodiversity or potential disability and the impacts of trauma or mental health concerns in children and students, and the ways to discern whether these challenges might be due to a disability or maybe environmental or circumstantial factors like deployment, caregiver illness, or grief. You can check the webinar event page that you see on the screen right there for information on CE credits, and and all that will be available there. Today's webinar offers several different types of CE credits and a certificate of attendance for general use. To receive either of these items, all participants will need to complete a two-step process that includes an evaluation and a follow-up survey of some kind, depending on the type of CE or certificate that you require. First, you'll complete an evaluation. We'll give you that link in just a moment to do that. After you complete the evaluation, you'll get a message on your screen that says, if you want this type of CE, click here. If you want this type of certificate, click here. You'll just need to choose the one that works for you and complete the next step. Once you've completed the second step, you will get an email with your certificate in it. Some email providers may direct your certificate to a spam folder, so please check there if you don't receive it within 24 to 48 hours of taking it. If it's not there, you can email us using the address on the screen there, ce@oneop.org. At this point, those who are here in the live audience, we're going to put a link to the evaluation in the chat. But if those of you that are watching on demand, or if you need to come back later to complete this process, you will find the link to the evaluation on the webinar event page. There'll be a purple button, just like the one you can see in front of you there. There'll be a purple button on the screen. And if you click that purple button that says continuing education on the webinar event page, it'll take you to the evaluation. If you get an error message, you may need to you probably that generally means that there's something going on with your settings or firewalls, and you may need to talk to your IT person regarding whatever that is. If you still get an error message, please take a picture of that and send it to us in an email. And if you have any questions regarding CEs or certificates or about today, you can reach us at ce@oneop.org. Be sure to visit us at our website, oneop.org, to explore upcoming events, articles, resources, and more. You can also find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We'll stick around for just a few more minutes for those who may need to grab some links or ask any last minute quick questions for clarity. And we thank you all for being here. And again, thank Dr. Austin for this wonderful time and all that she shared with us. And we hope everyone has a wonderful day.